Imagine walking down the street, and suddenly armed soldiers start pulling people out of their homes. Everyone is running away, hiding in total panic. People are begging to be let go. But one man stops. He turns around, looks a soldier right in the eye, and walks directly toward him on purpose. He actually wants to be captured. Why? Because he is about to do something no human being has ever done before and no one has ever done since. He is going to enter the most terrifying prison on earth by his own choice. This is a story of extreme bravery, but I have to warn you, the way it ends will completely break your heart. To really understand why a person would gladly walk into a nightmare, we have to look at where he came from. His name was Witold. He was born back in 1901 in a freezing, bitter town deep inside the Russian Empire. But his family did not live there because they wanted to. They were forced to be there. Long before he was even born, his grandfather had fought for the freedom of Poland. Because of that, the rulers took everything from his family. They took their land, their money, and their future, and they banished them to the freezing cold of Siberia. Growing up, Witold heard endless stories from his parents about sacrifice. He grew up hearing about ancestors who gave up their lives for a country that did not even exist anymore. Poland had been torn apart by huge empires a long time ago. It was just a memory, a ghost of a nation. But then, when he was just 17 years old, a miracle happened. The First World War ended, the giant empires fell apart, and Poland finally became a real country again. Most teenagers would celebrate, but Witold did not throw a party. He grabbed a gun. Within just a few months, he was out there fighting the Germans. By the time he was 19, he was fighting the Soviets, who were trying to crush his newly reborn country. By his 20th birthday, he was already a veteran of 2 fierce wars. After all that fighting, peace finally came. And then Witold did something really surprising. He became totally ordinary. He settled down. He married a very kind school teacher named Maria. They had 2 beautiful kids, a boy and a girl. He took over the family farm, he painted pictures, and he wrote poetry. For nearly 20 whole years, he lived a beautiful, quiet life. He was just a farmer, a loving dad, and a man who loved his country, secretly hoping he would never have to go to war ever again. But on September 1st, 1939, the call came. War was back. Germany invaded from one side, and soon after, the Soviets attacked from the other. His beloved Poland was completely crushed in just a matter of weeks. Witold could have run away. Many leaders and officers escaped to France or Britain to save themselves, but he refused to leave. He stayed right there in the capital city of Warsaw and helped start a secret underground army. It was one of the very first resistance groups in all of Europe. They worked in the shadows, spying on the enemy, ruining enemy plans, and waiting for the right moment to fight back. Then the dark rumors began to spread. People in the underground started whispering about a new camp the enemy had built near a small town. They called the camp Auschwitz. Polish people were being packed onto trains and sent there. Teachers, leaders, secret fighters, they were all disappearing into this camp, and not a single one of them ever came back. The secret army was getting very worried. They had no idea what was actually going on behind those barbed wire fences. Was it just a normal prison? Was it a place where people were forced to work? Or was it something much, much worse? They desperately needed someone on the inside. They needed a spy to find out the truth, to organize the prisoners, and to send a message to the outside world.
The commander of the secret army looked around the room. Every man there knew what this meant. Whoever went inside that camp might never, ever see the light of day. Witold raised his hand. Think about that for a moment. He was 39 years old. He had a wife waiting for him at home. He had 2 young kids who loved him. He had already fought in 2 brutal wars. He had every excuse in the world to look down at the floor and stay quiet. But he knew something the others did not. He knew that if nobody went inside, the world would never find out the truth. And if the world did not know, nobody would ever stop it. So, his bosses gave him a totally fake name and a fake background. He was no longer a soldier. He was now just a regular worker from Warsaw. The day he left, he looked at his wife and told her something she didn't understand at all. He told her not to try to buy his freedom. He told her not to look for him or try to save him. He just said he was going somewhere very important. She wouldn't understand what those words meant for many, many years. Then he walked out into the street, found a place where soldiers were capturing people, and let them take him away. What he didn't know was that the place he was going to would make every terrible battle he had ever seen look like a walk in the park. The train ride took 2 full days. They were given no food, no water, and no answers. Guards beat them with heavy clubs, threw them onto trains, and locked the doors. When the doors finally opened again, Witold stepped into a completely different universe. He later wrote that the moment he walked through those gates, he felt like he was no longer on planet Earth. When he arrived in late 1940, the camp was not yet the massive factory of death we know from the history books. The giant gas chambers had not yet been built, but it was already a pure living nightmare. Prisoners were beaten simply for looking at a guard. They were beaten for not looking at a guard. They were beaten for walking too slowly and beaten for walking too fast. They were forced to work from the very moment the sun came up until it was pitch black outside. They dug holes, carried heavy rocks, and built massive buildings. If you got too tired and fell down, a guard would just shoot you on the spot. The food they were given was practically nothing, just a bowl of dirty, watery soup and a piece of rock-hard bread. It was barely enough to keep your heart beating so you could work, but it was nowhere near enough to keep you healthy. Most people who arrived there only lived for about 6 weeks. They shaved Witold's head. They put him in a thin, striped uniform. They took away his name and gave him a number. From then on, he was just prisoner number 4859. Any normal person would have just tried to survive. A normal person would put their head down, hide in the background, and pray to make it to the next day. But Witold was not a normal person. In his very first week in that awful place, he started building his secret army. Building a secret underground network inside a place where the guards watch your every move sounds totally impossible, and it almost was. The camp was full of spies. Some prisoners would happily tell your secrets just to get an extra piece of bread or to live one more day. If you said the wrong word to the wrong person, you would be killed instantly, and the guards would kill everyone you ever spoke to as well. But Witold figured out a brilliant way to do it. He built his army in tiny groups of 5 men. Each group only knew the people inside their own little circle. That way, if one person got caught and the guards tortured him, he could only give up a few names. The rest of the secret army would be totally safe. He had to be so careful. He would recruit people just by giving them a certain look while standing in line, or whispering quickly while carrying stones. One single mistake meant death for everyone. But it worked. By early 1941, his secret army had hundreds of members spread everywhere. He had men working in the kitchen who would sneak extra food to people who were starving to death. He had men in the hospital who would hide sick prisoners so the guards wouldn't kill them. He had men working in the office who copied secret files. Every tiny thing they did was a huge victory. Every time a prisoner lived another day, it was a slap in the face to the enemy.
But his biggest job was not just saving lives inside. His biggest job was telling the outside world. He came up with crazy ways to send messages. Sometimes, when a prisoner was actually allowed to leave the camp, Witold would make them memorize an entire report, word for word. They would walk out with the message hidden entirely inside their heads and recite it to the secret army back in the city. Other times, he would hide tiny notes inside dirty laundry or inside the clothes of people who had died and were being taken out. Just 1 month after he got there, his very first report made it out. It traveled all the way to London, to the Allies, to the biggest leaders in the world. The world was finally being told the truth. But this is where the story gets incredibly frustrating. The world simply did not want to listen. Over the next year, Witold watched the camp turn into something so evil it is hard to even say out loud. The enemy built a new section. They built gas chambers. They built huge ovens. It was no longer just a prison. It became a machine designed for one single purpose: murder. Huge trains started pulling in every single day. The doors would open, and doctors would stand there just pointing their fingers. Left, right, left, right. That one little point decided if you lived or died. The old people, the sick people, the children, they were all sent to the right. And going to the right meant you would be dead in a few hours. Most of these people never even got a prisoner number. They were killed the exact same day they arrived. Witold watched all of this. He wrote everything down. He found out the huge ovens could burn thousands of bodies every single day. He realized this was not just random cruelty. It was a giant, planned-out machine meant to wipe out an entire group of people. He kept sending reports. He begged the outside world to do something. He begged them to drop bombs on the camp. The prisoners were actually begging the Allies to drop bombs right on their own heads. They said that even if the bombs killed them, it would be better than living in that nightmare. Think about how bad a place has to be for people to beg bombs to fall on them. The story of the man who volunteered for Auschwitz is so shocking because of what happened next. His reports reached the highest levels of power. The biggest, strongest countries in the world read his detailed notes, and they did absolutely nothing. They did not send any bombs. They did not send any rescue teams. They didn't even make a big speech about it on the radio. They just took the proof of the worst crime in human history, put it in a folder, and filed it away. Later on, the leaders claimed that flying airplanes over the camp was just too dangerous. They said it was too far away. But that was a total lie, because later in the war, American planes flew right directly over that exact camp. They dropped bombs on factories just a few miles down the road. They took clear photographs from the sky, showing the gas chambers, the ovens, and the trains. They saw every bit of it with their own eyes, but they chose to look the other way. One terrible day, an enemy guard laughed and told a group of new prisoners something haunting. He said, "Even if we lose this war, we have already won the war against you. None of you will be left alive to tell the story. And even if one of you somehow survives, the world will never believe you." Witold wanted to prove that guard wrong so badly.
But he was slowly learning a very sad truth. The problem was not that the world did not believe him. The problem was that the world did not care. Living inside that camp was a daily fight against death. Witold was forced to work outside in the freezing winter snow without a warm coat. His fingers cracked open and bled. His wooden shoes did nothing to stop the ice from freezing his feet. He even had to do building work right next to the giant ovens. He could hear the loud machines running all day. He could smell the smoke, but he could not stop working, because stopping meant getting a bullet in the head. He spent days carrying dead bodies. He got to stack them up like blocks of wood. Sometimes he looked down and recognized the faces of his own friends. He got terribly sick with pneumonia, and then he caught an awful fever called typhus. Either of those sicknesses should have killed him instantly. Going to the camp hospital usually meant you were going to be killed, because the guards would just come in and shoot anyone who was too weak to stand. But his secret army saved his life. His men who worked in the hospital hid him. They changed his medical papers. They snuck him tiny bits of medicine. They kept him breathing when the whole camp was designed to end his life. The average person lasted 6 weeks. Witold lasted 947 days. During that whole time, his army kept fighting back. They started stealing things, a tiny gun here, a few bullets there. They hid them in walls where the guards would never look. They started breaking the tools so the work would slow down. They even started killing the worst guards. But they couldn't just shoot them, or everyone would be punished. So they made the deaths look like total accidents. A guard would get mysterious food poisoning, or a heavy machine would suddenly drop on them. They even built a working radio from scratch inside the camp. They snuck the parts in piece by piece, hiding wires inside loaves of bread. They put it together in the dark, speaking only in whispers. For a long time, they were secretly broadcasting radio messages right out of the most guarded death camp on Earth. Witold and his men were completely ready. They had weapons hidden. They had hundreds of men ready to fight. All they needed was the signal from the outside world to start a massive riot. But that signal never came. By early 1943, Witold knew his time was running out. The secret police were starting to figure things out. Some of his best friends had been caught and killed. His own fake name was no longer protecting him. He knew that if he stayed any longer, he would be dragged into a torture room. He was a tough man, but he was terrified that if they tortured him enough, he might break and give up the names of his friends. He had to get out. But escaping was almost impossible. Out of all the people who tried to run away over the years, barely anyone ever made it. If you got caught, they would hang you in front of the whole camp to scare everyone else. But Witold had a plan. He managed to get himself and 2 trusted friends assigned to work in a bakery that was located just outside the heavy fences. On a dark night in April 1943, they made their move. When people ask how the man who broke into Auschwitz finally escaped, this is exactly what he did. They waited until the middle of the night. They cut the wires to the telephones and the loud alarms. They used a fake key they had been secretly carving for months to open a heavy door. Suddenly, a guard saw them. They rushed him, knocked him to the ground, and ran as fast as humanly possible into the pitch-black night. Witold later said he could hear gunshots blasting right behind his head. He said they ran so fast it felt like their hands were tearing the air apart. They ran deep into the dark woods. They crossed a freezing river. They walked for over 60 miles right through enemy territory. They had to hide in the dirt all day and only walk when the sun went down. Thankfully, kind local people risked their own lives to give them food and a place to hide. After a whole week of running, they finally found the secret Polish army. Witold was finally free. He had spent over 2.5 years living inside pure evil. He had built an army out of starving prisoners. He had brought out the exact proof the world needed. He finally thought the nightmare was over and he could save his friends. But what happened next actually broke his heart even more than the camp did.
In August 1943, Witold walked into the secret army headquarters. He slammed down 100 pages of detailed reports. He had maps of the camp. He had the schedules of the guards. He knew where all the guns were kept. He laid out a perfect plan to attack the camp. He told the generals, "My men are ready inside. If you attack the front gates, we will attack from the inside. We can kill the guards, blow up the ovens, and free thousands of people." The generals sat there, looked at his papers, and just shook their heads. They said no. They told him it was just a dream. They said they did not have enough soldiers or enough guns. They said that even if they somehow won the battle, they had nowhere to hide thousands of starving prisoners, and the enemy would just come back and kill everyone anyway. Witold begged them. He cried out in frustration. He told them about the gas chambers. He told them about the massive trains filled with crying children. He told them that thousands of innocent people were turning into smoke every single day. It did not change their minds. The military reality was just too hard. The generals felt that risking their army for the camp would ruin the rest of the war. Looking back, the generals might have been right about the numbers, but being mathematically right did not make the truth any easier to swallow. Witold had walked into the mouth of hell on purpose. He survived almost 1,000 days of torture. He risked his life 1,000,000 times to bring them the truth, and their only answer was, "We cannot help you." The giant countries of the world would not drop bombs. His own secret army would not attack. Everyone in charge knew exactly what terrible things were happening, and they all just decided to look away. At that moment, Witold could have just walked away forever. He could have found a quiet cabin in the woods and waited for the war to end. He had already done 1,000,000 times more than anyone could ever ask a human being to do. But instead, he picked up his gun. He still had a country to fight for. In the summer of 1944, a massive battle called the Warsaw Uprising began. The Polish secret army decided to rise up and try to take back their capital city from the Germans before the Soviet army could arrive. They wanted to prove they could free themselves so the Soviets would not just take over their country. Even though he was exhausted, even though his heart was heavy, Witold ran right to the front lines. He ended up leading soldiers in the absolute worst, bloodiest street battles. They were fighting side by side, house by house. They were throwing homemade bombs at giant metal tanks. For over 2 months, the brave Polish fighters held their ground. The Soviet army marched right up to the edge of the city, just across the river. They could clearly see the Polish people fighting and dying, but the Soviets just stopped. They set up their camps, sat down, and watched. They actually let the Germans destroy the city. They let hundreds of thousands of innocent people die, and they let the city get burned to the ground just so the Polish fighters would be wiped out. It made taking over the country much easier for them later. Somehow, Witold survived again. He was shot, he was bleeding, but he kept fighting. Finally, when the city finally fell, he had to give himself up. He was put onto a train and sent to an enemy prisoner of war camp. He sat there in the cold, waiting out the last long months of the war. Finally, in the spring of 1945, American soldiers drove their tanks through the gates and freed the prisoners.
The biggest war in history was finally over. Witold was free, but his beloved Poland was not. The Soviet Union had completely taken over his country. They threw out the real Polish leaders. They set up a fake communist government that took orders directly from Moscow. And suddenly, the brave men and women of the secret army, the people who had spent years fighting the Nazis, were now being called enemies of the state. Witold was sitting safely in the West. He could have easily moved to America or Britain. He could have written a book about his life, gotten a nice house, and grown old in peace. But he could not let it go. He volunteered for one last mission, and it would end up being the most dangerous thing he ever did. In late 1945, Witold sneaked back into communist-controlled Poland using a brand-new fake name. His job was to spy on this new, cruel government. He needed to write down all the terrible things they were doing and stay in touch with his old army friends who were now hiding in the forests. He knew how dangerous this was. The new secret police were hunting down heroes just like him. They were grabbing people in the middle of the night, torturing them in dark basements, and shooting them in the woods. But he went anyway. For a year and a half, he lived in the shadows. He changed his job all the time. He constantly moved from one tiny apartment to another. He wrote secret reports about the terrible things the communists were doing to his people, and he sent those reports through hidden messengers back to London. His bosses sent him urgent messages. They told him the secret police knew who he was. They told him his cover was completely blown and he needed to run away immediately. But his wife and his kids were still in the city. He just couldn't bring himself to leave his family behind again. On May 8, 1947, exactly 2 years to the day after the big war ended, the communist secret police kicked down the door and arrested Witold. This is the cruelest part of the whole story. The very same people who ignored his cries for help during the war, the same powerful nations that refused to drop bombs, the same world that covered its eyes while millions suffered, now that exact same world was going to cover its eyes again while a fake government destroyed the man who had tried to save everybody. They dragged him to a terrifying prison and threw him in the basement. The torture they put him through lasted for months. It was so brutal, so violent, that Witold later managed to whisper a completely shocking sentence to his wife. He looked at her and said, "Auschwitz was nothing compared to this." Just pause and let that sink in. A man who spent nearly 1,000 days in a literal factory of death, a man who survived freezing cold, starvation, and diseases, looked at what his own people were doing to him and said it was much worse. The guards in the camp had been terrible monsters, but they didn't know him. To them, he was just a number on a list. But the communists who were torturing him were his own neighbors. They spoke the same language. They were breaking his bones simply because he loved his country too much. They wanted names. They wanted to know every single person he had ever talked to. They wanted him to hand over the friends he had spent his whole life protecting, but he never said a single word. They kept him awake for days. They beat him until he could barely breathe. They used methods designed to completely break a human mind, but Witold swallowed the pain and protected his friends. In March 1948, they put him on trial. But it wasn't a real trial. It was just a fake show put on for the newspapers. The judges had already decided they were going to kill him before he even walked into the room.
They accused him of being a spy for foreign enemies. They accused him of trying to murder politicians. They made up fake evidence. They beat other people until they signed fake papers against him. Witold was not even allowed to speak to defend himself. Nobody was allowed to speak up for him. His lawyer was barely allowed to say a word.
The judges were just party members reading lines off a script. A few days later, they read the verdict. They declared him guilty of every single fake crime, and they sentenced him to death. Witold sat down in his tiny cell and wrote a desperate letter to the president, begging for his life. His wife wrote letters, his lawyer wrote letters, but the president threw them all in the trash. But there is one amazing thing that happened in that courtroom that the evil government could not hide. Right at the very end, the judges asked Witold if he had anything to say. He slowly stood up. He straightened his back, looked those men directly in the eye, and said with a steady voice, "I have been trying to live my life so that in the hour of my death I would rather feel joy than fear." He was not afraid of them. They had broken his body, but they never even put a scratch on his spirit. After all the horrors of the camps, after all the betrayals, he was still the exact same brave man who walked into that capture line all those years ago. He was still willing to give up his life for the truth. On a dark evening in late May 1948, the guards grabbed Witold and dragged him deep into the basement of the prison. A man they called the Butcher was waiting for him in the shadows. Witold took a final breath and yelled his last words, "Long live free Poland!" Then they shot him once in the back of the head. It was the exact same cowardly way the enemy had killed thousands of his friends in the forests years ago. He was only 47 years old. They did not give him a proper burial. They threw his body into a dirt hole somewhere in secret, completely unmarked. Then they tried to erase his memory from the earth. For the next 40 long years, it was a crime to even speak his name out loud in his own country. His amazing story was totally banned. Nobody was allowed to thank him. His poor wife had to spend the rest of her life scrubbing floors as a cleaning lady just to buy bread. His children grew up being treated like dirt, labeled as the kids of a traitor. They did not even find out the real truth about what an absolute hero their father was until the 1990s. To this very day, nobody has ever found his grave. The man who willingly broke into hell to save humanity has no tombstone. He has no resting place. He just has a story. A story that was almost completely wiped away forever. Witold gave every single piece of himself to a world that never gave him anything back. But his courage remains one of the brightest lights in the darkest time in human history. He showed us that even when the whole world turns a blind eye, one person standing up for the truth still matters. Thank you so much for joining me to hear this incredible story today. I know it is heavy, but it is a story that absolutely needs to be heard. If you felt moved by Witold's bravery, please hit that like button to help spread his memory, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss another deep dive into the past. Welcome to the family here at Ethereal Bygone. I will see you in the next one.